You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello and welcome back to Retail Disrupted. Today, I am thrilled to have Ken Towle with me on the podcast. Ken has a wealth of experience in the UK grocery sector. He spent a lot of time at Tesco, where he led the international expansion and acceleration of the group's multi-channel capability. Some of his previous roles at Tesco include CEO of Tesco China, Internet Retailing Director, and Managing Director of Central Europe, Ireland, and Turkey. More recently, Ken has worked for the Alshaya Group, where he was president of fashion and teens. He was the CEO of convenience store chain Nisa, and he led that business through the pandemic, so we're going to touch on that. And most recently, Ken served as the SVP of Retail and Logistics at Asda. Ken and I are going to cover a ton of ground. We're going to talk about supermarkets, we're going to talk about inflation, e-commerce, consumer trends, the works. But first, a quick update on the podcast. I'm going to be flying to Florida tomorrow. I am going to be totally off grid, totally offline for 2 weeks. I'm going to spend some time with my parents who live out in Florida. And I don't know about you, but I feel like since Christmas, it has been just nonstop. It's been go, go, go. And although I have really enjoyed all of the work that I've been doing, I've had some amazing guests on the podcast. Amazing to see the podcast grow as well and get feedback from you all. And also just speaking at a lot of events. I feel like events are really back and in a big way this year. So it's been great, but it's been so busy, and I'm really looking forward to getting on that plane tomorrow and having some time off. So I will be leaving all of my devices, my laptop, my microphone, everything is staying here in London, and you will not hear from me or Retail Disrupted for a good couple of weeks. I will be back mid-April, and if you don't already subscribe, I would encourage you to subscribe to the podcast because I have some amazing guests lined up from mid-April, including the former CEO of Blockbuster. The podcast is actually booked out now until June, but I'm always looking for new guests. I'm always looking for suggestions around topics to cover. So as always, please do feel free to get in touch. You can reach me on email. My email is natalie@nbkretail.com, or on any of the social channels. I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter /X, Facebook, and I'm also now on Instagram. I finally joined the 21st century. So you can reach me on any of those platforms, and I would love to hear from you as well. Okay, that's everything from me. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with Ken Towle. I would love to kick off by getting your thoughts on the consumer and retail environment. So we know that consumers have been broadly resilient given all of the disruption that's been thrown at them. And I think there's some encouraging signs that the economic pressures that have faced consumers over the past 18 months or so are now beginning to ease. But my take is that we're not out of the woods yet. So I'm curious to get your thoughts, Ken. What kind of year do you think retailers can expect in 2024?
Sure. Well, look, I think the idea of a consumer is disappeared. You know, we've got polarized consumers now in society, and so therefore the year will look very different. You know, if you've paid off your mortgage, if you've got a defined benefit pension, things are probably looking pretty rosy. If you're trying to get on the housing ladder and your mortgage rate's just gone up, then they're going to be looking quite different. So therefore, I think the consumer is going to be very much influenced by those sort of macro costs in their life, particularly housing and travel. And also the idea of wanting to be able to afford the occasional treat or maybe chip away, those types of things. So making life tolerable and enjoyable. So I think depending on which sector you're in, if you're in food, in grocery, then people are always going to have to eat. We've seen some of those trends of people thinking about the pennies manifesting themselves with, the advance of own label, people being very conscious about where they shop, the rise of the discounters. It's all very well documented. I think for those consumers, if you're in a discretionary product group, clothing, jewelry, those sorts of areas, furniture, you're probably going to find that consumers will delay purchasing because whether they've got the cash to buy today or they're going to do it on extended credit, either way, they're probably going to be a bit more cautious. Whereas if you're in that other consumer group I was describing a moment ago, probably life carries on and there's probably some great deals to be had out there. So I think it's a mixed picture, but overall, I think the year will be one of, I think, improving outlook. So I think first half probably more tricky. Second half we'll be heading into an election. People might have the benefit of tax cuts coming through, interest rates falling, inflation falling. So I'd say the second half is one to be much more optimistic about.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think again, it just drives home that point that as retailers, one size no longer fits all, and you really do have to know your customer and what they're dealing with. Just to some thoughts around the pace of change, because you've been in this business for a long time, and so you're incredibly well versed in just how dynamic of an industry this is. And I think that's what attracts so many of us to retail, that it is so fast moving, it's constantly evolving. But I think we have to acknowledge that the pace of change has really accelerated in recent years. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind when we say that is the pandemic, because that was the big shock that upended our lives and really changed the way that we shop. But even before the pandemic, we had the rise of online shopping. We had the mobile commerce revolution, which I think many of us often forget about because shopping on our phones is just the norm these days. We've had all the efforts to digitize physical retail, so technology in stores, and now we're moving into this whole new world of artificial intelligence. And for a while, the word permacrisis was thrown around quite a lot to describe the state of retail and probably the state of the world. Because on top of COVID and all of the tech disruption, we also had some pretty significant economic and geopolitical disruption. Now, I would argue that we're safely out of that perma-crisis era, and perhaps a better way to describe what we're seeing today is perma-disruption. And I appreciate that definitely does not roll off the tongue so nicely. But I'd love to get your thoughts on this idea of perma-disruption and whether you think the industry can sustain this pace of change, or maybe things will slow down a little bit in the future. What do you think, Ken?
Well, I would say that you learn over time that change is a constant. And actually, when you look back, and I think you think to some of those big seismic changes in the industry and in the world of commerce, they felt very, very incremental at the time. But you start changing something and it becomes massive. If I took a simple example, there was a time not that long ago where there were no self-service checkouts in the UK. Now something like 80% of transactions are going through self-service checkouts. It didn't move as a big bang, but it was a profound change, and it took 2 decades to play out. And I think what we'll find is that we've got this constant level of things that started quite a long time ago, gaining momentum, becoming more familiar to customers and more familiar. We've got technology becoming more available and cheaper. We've also had this really interesting dynamic, something which I think we're all pleased about, which is people in retail earning more. But because they're earning more, it means that there's a greater case for technology and automation and the affordability of capital instead of labour. So all of that I think is really, really fascinating. And then I think there's a lot of conjecture about what something like AI might do in the future. I think the reality is that for retail, great retailing requires doing a fairly short list of things really consistently, really well, to a standard that customers appreciate and can differentiate you from your competitors. And I think the most significant opportunity with artificial intelligence is actually in doing those basics even better, or doing them for a lower cost. If you take something as straightforward, apparently, as keeping products on sale, there's a lot of intelligence that can be applied to just making that outcome better, or complementarily, making the inputs to that outcome cheaper or easier to manage.
Yeah, and that's what I keep hearing from previous guests who've said that the beauty of AI and generative AI in particular is that it solves genuine pain points. It's
Mm-hmm.
not going to be the next metaverse, because it's here, it's now, and it can genuinely improve the experience for the customer and genuinely make retailers smarter and more efficient. So I'm really fascinated to see where that goes. Now, I don't usually like to dwell on the pandemic, but as I have you here and you were the CEO of Nisa at the time, I'd really love to hear what it was like running a retailer during this bizarre and very unsettling period. So, how did you manage it? And I suppose, more importantly, what were the lasting lessons? And how do you think the industry has changed as a result?
Yes, no, it seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? But it
It
actually
does.
wasn't that far away. And we're still seeing some of the legacy effects of that. The Nisa business, for those that don't know, is a wholesale business that's servicing independent retailers. And I think uh, in the Nisa business, like the rest of the industry, whether in retail, supply chain, or in manufacturing, what we experienced for many of us for the first time in our working lives was scarcity. We hadn't seen demand go beyond what was available. In fact, we've benefited for a long, long time from proliferation of choice and the
Mm,
abundance of product. So I think that was the first big shock, that people responded to the pandemic in a way that was, looking after their family, making sure they had what they needed. But that created a lot of disruption in the supply chain and in the availability of products. So I think as a consequence of that, two big things emerged: a much deeper respect for supply chain specialists and that real science and ability to manage supply chain. But also, I think it brought the industry closer together. In the past, we've had the creation of the grocery adjudicator because of levels of distrust or not enough trust between retailers and suppliers. I think the pandemic brought everyone much, much closer together, because actually it wasn't about a negotiation, it was about a collaboration and ultimately doing the right thing for consumers, whether you were servicing them directly or you were at the beginning end of that chain to get products to customers. So I think all of those things really mattered. I think one of the most profound changes we've got, which we're still grappling with, and you still hear and read a lot about this today, is where people work from and how they work. And I
mm.
think that will be one of the most prolific and profound changes that we still don't know quite how it is going to work out. And that has a big effect. If you're an in-town retailer or you're offering food to go in town, then you've seen big changes to your business. I think similarly, if you're in the e-commerce business, you probably found people are just at home a lot more, and so they're much happier to order products to be delivered to home. We're hearing a lot that businesses now are mandating minimum time in office locations. And so that, I think, will have quite an effect. And of course, we've got to remember all through that, retail frontline staff, manufacturing staff, logistics specialists, they've never had that option. So actually, we have to be reminded that they have continued to do an amazing job on behalf of the country and consumers. But I think for those that do have the choice, we're still seeing how that choice is going to be played out. And I think that will have an effect on how people shop, where they shop, frequency, all those dynamics of a consumer retailer relationship.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think it is still playing out in terms of, figuring out how much time in the office versus how much time from home, and yeah, companies changing their policies around that as well. So it certainly impacts retail. Now, we're going to shift gears a little bit, but we're going to stick with grocery retail. And there's a lot to explore, but if we start off with the doom and gloom, which is inflation, because we have to acknowledge that inflation has been a real bugbear for supermarkets over the past couple of years. Now, the good news, of course, is that food price inflation is finally easing. It reached a peak of around 19% in March last year. This was the highest rate in nearly half a century. It's been on a downward trajectory since then, but of course, prices are still rising. It's just that they're rising at a slower pace. And I think it's always nice to illustrate this with a little bit of data. So, just briefly, if you look at it over a 2-year period, in November 2023, food prices were still 30% higher than November 2021. So, again, just to go back to my earlier comment around not being out of the woods yet, I think that very much applies here. Now, Ken, the last thing any supermarket wants to do is to pass on additional costs to their customer in the form of higher prices. And that's probably especially true in a cost of living crisis, and especially when you've got the discounters breathing down your necks, right? But then we also know that margins in the grocery sector are razor thin. So, how, in your view, should supermarkets be dealing with inflation?
Yeah, I think in the UK, and in much of the developed world, we've seen an inflation shock because we've been used to single-digit inflation for a very long time, or in fact, nearly no inflation. There are other parts of the world where actually inflation is a feature of the market, and they've just become more accustomed to doing that. And as input costs go up, so do wages and retail prices, etc. So, given that we had a shock, I think the first thing that was of I think some surprise to everybody was the scale of it. So, to get into double digit and for that to be sustained sometime and get up into those giddy levels of 19, 20%, no one I think would have
Mm,
predicted that. But also, I think businesses have a responsibility to stay healthy. And I think, in earlier years when inflation was lower, there's probably some pleasure and some pride in being able to absorb inflation for consumers because you do things to mitigate that in your supply chain or in your cost of goods or whatever. But it was at such a scale that that wasn't possible, and so it did have to be passed on to consumers. And it was interesting that no one was absent from that. That approach, discounters included. And in fact, there was a lot of concern about the fact that some of the commodities seemed to be inflating much more than manufactured products. But that was because of the nature of the products, and so everyone experienced that the same way. What I expect we'll see now, and that is a race to get. Well, firstly, the first race is to stop inflating.
mm.
I think there's a big question about whether we'll see deflation. I would expect we would see small levels of deflation. I think consumers will be hopeful of larger levels of deflation, but I think the reality is a lot of the changes that created inflation are embedded, and so therefore it's going to be hard to reverse them. But I think we'll get back to an attitude from retailers, a sort of a strategy from retailers that they will do their very best all the time to protect consumers from inflation through the way that they run their businesses in the interests of customers. The only other thing I'd say there is, all businesses having this responsibility to remain healthy and strong, they do have to make sure that if they're going to pass on keen prices, that ultimately they're able to make a return on that in order that they retain viable and can modernize and improve their business in the future, which if you're making no money is hard to do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But you're right. The supermarket is the gatekeeper to the customer. They're the ones who, need to protect their customers from higher margins because the market's just too competitive, right? It's they don't really have a choice. And one of the ways that we've seen supermarkets look to manage inflation, for lack of a better word, is by keeping the price the same but reducing the pack size, also known as shrinkflation in the industry. And this has caused some tension with suppliers, and I think for obvious reasons, right? And I think if we look outside of the UK, there's been some really interesting, reactions and backlash, I suppose, from the supermarkets. So in France, we've seen some supermarkets create warning signs at the shelf edge to make their customers aware that this is a smaller pack size. And I just learned that the Hungarian government is making it a requirement that large food retailers have to label items that have shrunk in weight or volume. So, really interesting, I think, some really interesting reactions around the world. Do you think we might see more of this kind of response here in the UK or, in fact, in other markets around the world?
I hope not, because I think our industry is best when it's regulated appropriately, but not onerously. And I think the idea that you have to start providing lots of information to customers about price changes, pack size changes, etc., is a level of detail actually that consumers generally are not asking for. Most consumers want simple, fast, frictionless shopping, and having lots of superfluous information it's not really what they want. What they want is trust in the retailer, that the retailer is doing the best possible job for them on their behalf and not profiteering. So I think, consumers want to know they're getting a fair price and a good deal for products, and that's important. Now, interestingly, I think there's going to be a slight juxtaposition there with portion size and with calorific value. So if you think about some of the products that in the last decade got supersized, that's not necessarily to the advantage of the end consumer, particularly if that's part of an unhealthy diet, let's call it,
Mm.
without making judgment about that. But I think in the future, given that a lot of these products that actually have reduced in price are manufactured and they're quite high calorific products, I think actually pack size reduction might serve another purpose, which is, helping address this big issue that we've got in the country of obesity and health.
And just moving on to price matching, we want to spend a little bit more time on price, and then we'll move on from price and inflation generally. But it is a big topic, so I'd like to get a few more um, questions to throw at you here. So price matching, especially when we've seen a lot of price matching in the industry, and we've especially seen a lot of price matching of the discounters. And I can understand the rationale, of course, but Just how sustainable of a strategy is this? And considering that the discounters operate from a completely different business model, and how do you think it's working to stem the tide of shoppers switching to the discounters?
Well, I think it's interesting because price, I think, became a lot easier to understand for consumers with the growth of online shopping. So as retailers were publishing their online shopping list and their prices, it then became very much easier for consumers to compare. And in fact, there's lots of well-known websites where you can go and all that work is done for you. However, because the discounters tend not to have an online offer, understanding the discounter price is therefore a bit more difficult. Now, because of the perception of discounters having really cheap prices, clearly that carries some weight for customers. And I think we have moved away from the position of, let's say, 2 decades ago, where you could get cheap products at discounters. It was cheap products for low prices. Now we're in a position where you can get good quality products for good prices, and that's quite a different proposition. It's all about the value to customers. So I think reassuring customers, and again coming back to this idea of a trusting relationship between a consumer and a retailer, knowing that one of the big supermarkets is not a discounter, but that they are doing their bit to make sure that you don't have to overpay on all the basics, but then giving you all the benefits of choice that come with their increased space and their ability to put that range together and sustain it. That's something which I think a lot of customers still appreciate. And if you look at the level of cross shopping in the UK, customers have become definitely more promiscuous, and therefore, as a result, they're no doubt more aware of what the individual retailers are offering. But even with that knowledge, they are still making choices. They will place some of their purchases in a discounter store, but they'll also reserve a number of their purchases for one of the bigger supermarkets. And that's all about choice, but it's also about that ease of access because there's more of those stores, and it's also about understanding that you want a balance between choice and price as well as quality and price.
Now, you've talked about shoppers becoming more promiscuous, and I think that's a nice segue to my next question, which is around loyalty pricing. Over the past couple of years, we've seen this big shift towards loyalty pricing, which, I mean, I grew up in the US, and this is just how things have always been in the
Mm.
US, where you get one price if you have a loyalty card. And if you don't, that's you pay a higher price. And it's essentially a two-tiered model. Now, there's a big debate about whether this actually drives loyalty or, in fact, makes us less loyal because, it's if we're all going to be swiping um, our cards or tapping, our phones at the checkout, we're just gonna. It's a no brainer. Of course, you're going to do it. I don't know if it necessarily makes you more loyal to that particular supermarket, but that's probably a debate for another day. But the supermarkets, even if they're not getting our loyalty, they're definitely getting some valuable data out of this. And now the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, is launching an investigation to see whether these member-only discounts are actually restricting competition and disadvantaging those who aren't eligible for a loyalty card, like older kids who are buying lunch, for example. Now, the other argument against these schemes is that it can be difficult to compare prices, similar to your point about comparing discounter prices, but it can be difficult to compare prices. And there's also a question about whether these member prices offer genuine savings or if retailers are simply inflating the non member price to create the illusion of a discount. So there's lots to explore. The flip side, of course, is that, you can argue that this is totally normal behavior in a highly competitive market, right? So, what do you think, Ken? I'm curious to get your take on this issue.
Sure. Well, look, the first thing I'd say is customers obviously get it, because they're adopting it in vast numbers and to a very high degree. And actually, if you look at a couple of the big retailers in the UK, since they've been doing this, they have been actually be able to point to market share gains. So it does suggest that loyalty is coming through in some measurable way. So I'd suggest customers do get it, and that it is influencing their behaviour as a result. So I think generally it's positive. I think it's a lot to do with just how easy it is. And in fact, I think most retailers, other than your point about younger children or children, it is something which is accessible to all and actually is easy to apply. In some ways, it's the old promotion on-off cycle, now changed into member pricing in some shape or form. Neither the retailer nor the manufacturers are making any more or less money as a consequence, I'd suggest. I think they're just choosing to use that money, I'd say, more smartly. And I think also the fact that the data penetration, the customer penetration is so much better, the data that can be extracted is going to be so much more powerful, particularly in convenience. So if we look at online shopping in the UK, it's always been data rich because you've got all the data from the customer. In fact, you know a lot about your customer. Supermarket, big store shopping has always been pretty rich with data, but the convenience segment has always been quite poor because transaction levels are lower and customers are less inclined to get out their loyalty card for a convenience transaction. But member pricing seems to have transformed that. And I think what we'll see is not only have we got convenience growing as a channel, according to forecasts in the market over the next few years, but I think what we'll see is it will be a richer channel in terms of source of customer insight and understanding, and therefore that will accelerate the growth of that channel because both the retailers and the manufacturers will be able to use that information to do an even better job for consumers in the convenience sector.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Now, we've talked a lot about inflation and pricing strategies, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on some other challenges or priorities facing the grocery industry at the moment. So, we obviously have the discounters, there's the kind of perennial challenge of e commerce profitability, there's the whole repurposing physical stores and figuring out things like automation and AI, as we sort of touched on earlier. But what do you see as some of the big priorities for the mainstream grocers in 2024?
I think a lot will be more of the same.
Okay.
So, doing the basics really, really well. I think we're going to have to be very mindful about that channel switch and also the behavior of customers across channels and how we recognize that behavior and respond to it in a helpful way. I think the fact that we're going to have polarized groups of customers in the market is going to present some challenges. And given that we largely have single price points across the UK rather than regional pricing, I think that means that puts a lot of emphasis on really good ranging. Both I think Tesco and Sainsbury's have made quite a play on how, and Morrison's as well actually, about how they've been putting more of their value products into their convenience stores. And I think being very mindful of where customers are feeling the pinch is making sure that store ranges reflect that. And also where people want to treat themselves, that store ranges reflect that as well. And then I think I'd probably sum it all up by saying this balance, which has never gone away, but is probably a bit harder and is moving faster these days, is the balance between the proposition you want to give to your customers, the operating model you use to deliver that proposition, and the returns that you get on that. And if you get those out of balance, then that can be quite problematic for businesses. And so I think in this faster moving environment with a lot of change around, keeping that balance and effectively keeping all stakeholders happy is going to be one of the big responsibilities and priorities for the year. And then add to that elections. Who knows what the outcome of that will be? Many would predict, but anyway, that's potentially going to bring further change into society as well in the UK.
That's really interesting. And I know you've talked a lot in the past about having a customer centric approach, which I think most retailers are on board with in terms of the principle of having a customer centric approach. But making it happen requires a huge cultural shift. This idea that you genuinely start with the customer and then work backwards. So, what advice would you give to retailers who are wanting to become more customer led in their approach?
In no particular order, I think I'd say it starts at the top. So if the leader of a business isn't interested enough in the consumer and the customer and what they're telling them and what they can do about what they're telling them, then that attitude and behaviour will manifest itself throughout the organisation. So the tone from the top, leadership, the role modelling, all of that is really, really critical. Then there's got to be really good sources of customer insight. Now that's both data, so the data side of things, but then that's also got to be complemented with both quantitative and qualitative customer insight as well, really understanding what's happening from a customer perspective. And complementing that with colleagues in the business, because they are very often there's a lot of frontline people in the industry. They get to hear things first. They get to see what works really well and delights customers. They also get to see what frustrates customers. So having an ability to pull back from colleagues in the business as well is really important. But then, of course, all of that is only of any value if you do something about it. And I think any business that's customer centric has got to be really, really clear about what they're doing, about what they've heard from customers, what they want, what customers are telling them that they do very well and they should maintain, and where they want to see improvement. And there's got to be quite a drumbeat of saying, we heard, we've acted, and we've improved things, and that to be a continuous process. And for that to be well understood across the business, that the business is doing things to make things better because it understands where those opportunities are.
Yeah, and that's actually sparked another thought, which is I think it's M&S that's now requiring everyone in their head office to spend a week on the shop floor, which I thought was really interesting. And I just think that that feels like a no-brainer, right? It feels like that's why is it taking the industry so long to incorporate this? And I guess cultures don't change overnight, and maybe that's what we're seeing play out now. But really interesting to see the way that things are moving. Now, I'm going to keep you here a little bit longer, Ken. I want to get your thoughts on e-commerce, and then I want to get your thoughts on how you see um, supermarkets evolving in the future. So, just to start with e-commerce, because we all know that grocery e-commerce is notoriously complex. We all embraced it during the pandemic, but then we quickly reverted back to physical stores. And I think that might be partly because of the timing of the cost of living crisis and people looking to shop at the discounters, which, I've dabbled with e-commerce, but haven't really made it work. Um, but I also feel like there's something more inherent here. So, what's your take on the current state of grocery commerce? And as we look to the future, are there any trends or developments that you're excited about?
Hmm. Well, look, I'd say that e-commerce is absolutely fantastic as a consumer. It's so easy and you have so much choice and it's so reliable and it's such good value. So, from a consumer perspective, it ticks many, many boxes. But interestingly, despite that, it's at what, 12, 13, 14% of the market, something like that.
Mm.
So despite all of that ease and attraction, 80 plus percent of customers, 85% plus of customers
Choose
are
friction.
choosing to shop in store. Yes, they choose the friction. And I think some of what we saw in the pandemic was actually customers who wanted to be in a shop but couldn't, either because they were restricted with access, or they were had to be thoughtful about their health, and not mixing with large groups of people. So I think there was a natural switch of people who would have gone shopping but couldn't, who have now reverted to going back to shopping. And retail is shopping is a social activity. Most people do it with someone else. Most people, they look forward to doing it, and also they look forward to sort of bringing the prizes home and enjoying that, sharing it with their family, consuming product, using product. So I think all of that will continue. I think the interesting area is going to be how much do you want and how quickly, because we saw a big spike in rapid commerce, small basket commerce,
Mm.
and we've seen a number of businesses get really aggressive about that, and we've seen a number fall by the wayside and consolidation. I think that picture hasn't finished forming yet, and there's still, I think there's still quite a demand from consumers for that type of offer at some time, for some people, for some occasions. But again, it's got to be one from which the provider of that service can make money, and that's still probably where the friction is in terms of the affordable operating model, the scalable operating model for that. But I think that's still a big part of the e-commerce channel that will develop over time.
Yeah. And do you think, just going back to your earlier point around the fact that more of us are working from home and that's changing the whole the landscape of retail more generally, but do you think that's also fueled demand for quick commerce if we're working from home and we just sort of need something within 15 minutes, whether that's some ingredients for a meal tonight or, actually getting food to go? If we're kind of in the middle of working and we don't necessarily have time to nip out, do you think that that's also helped to fuel that trend?
I think it definitely has. I think also it's part of why convenience has grown and will continue to grow, because convenience is closer to where people live. So I think it's having that dual effect of both being an attractive solution for people who are at home and want stuff delivered, but also if you're at home and you're close to your local convenience store, it's quite easy to pop out and
Yeah.
to get your products locally.
Yeah, yeah, and we all probably need a break and a walk at times throughout the day as
Exactly.
well.
Yes. Yeah.
Just one last thought around quick commerce because I think from my perspective, I think it's been really interesting to see more supermarket brands look to partner with the likes of Amazon or Uber Eats and perhaps to a lesser extent Deliveroo. But is I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on whether this kind of collaboration might be the way forward? Because, as you say, a big barrier is actually making money from all of this. So, does it make?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think we'll see more collaboration in order to make quick commerce work in the future?
I think we will. I think we're probably still in the phase where it's the easier option at the moment to sort of give someone else the big knotty issues to solve on your behalf. I think the watch out is that there's quite a premium being charged for that for consumers, and I think over time customers will become less willing to accept that premium, and therefore, the classic model of whoever's providing fairest value will probably win and sustain for the longest. And I think wherever you've got collaboration and partnership, you've got value share, so which is sometimes a helpful and necessary thing. But if you can do it yourself, then you haven't got to create value share, and you can probably do it for a bit cheaper and also make it a better return for yourself as well. And if you look at again some of the big supermarkets, they've now developed rapid options as well, and it looks to be done pretty well on the back of their existing infrastructure. So they're leveraging capability, leveraging scale in a way that's to the benefit of consumers.
Great. I've got one last question for you, Ken, and that's around international. So, you led Tesco's business in Central Europe, Ireland, and Turkey. And prior to that, you were CEO of Tesco in China. I know Tesco has since divested some of these operations, but I wonder if you can share with us some of the learnings of running a large multinational business overseas. Because I imagine there's a lot of synergies, but I also imagine at the same time there is a need for a very localized approach, which is probably a difficult balance at times. And also, the UK is very much seen as best in class when it comes to grocery innovation. But I'm curious to know if there were any reverse synergies. Was there anything that you learned from local markets that could be incorporated back into the UK operations?
Mhm. Yes, okay, that's great. Well, look, I think I'd start off by saying that one of the things I'd reflect on is that from an investor perspective, quite often it's hard to get an investor to appreciate the value you're creating in a market that's non-core or non-home, and therefore it's to be very thoughtful about how much opportunity there is in the home market, how deep penetrated you are in a home market, and how much return you can generate from deeper penetration in a home market as maybe a higher priority than necessarily getting into additional markets. That would be the first point. The second point would be if the conclusion is it's right to get into other markets, there are many ways of doing that. And I think franchise licensing, all of these types of things, joint ventures, I think offer attractive ways of getting brands out into new markets with the inherent capability that comes with working with local partners. And then I think the third thing I'd say is that retail is only the front end. And if you're going to do retail really well, particularly food retailing, you need a very strong back end as well with supply chain and the ability to source products. And I've certainly had the experience, which is a really good one in terms of your depth of understanding of consumer and your ability to make a business work. That when you step out of a market where you're market leader and you step into a market where you barely register on market share, you have to take a completely different approach to building out your business. But also, as much as you might be investing in shop front and retail space, you've got to be investing in supply chain, supply partner relationships, and in fresh food that gets even more complicated than in manufactured products. So it's been very thoughtful about the scale of the endeavor. And international expansion is not a quick win. It takes decades to carve out a winning position and one that you can protect. So it'll be very interesting to see how some of the brands more recently that have restated their international ambition get on with that. But I think there's many ways to do it, but the endeavor will be a long one.
Fascinating stuff. Ken, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. I've really enjoyed hearing your views and insights on food retail, and I'm sure our listeners will have gotten a lot of value from this conversation. So thank you once again for being here today, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.